You started seeing on the documents, and then we started realizing and figuring out that actually he did work really hard. You know, he used to like to joke, his favorite joke was, they say hard work never killed anyone, but I say why take chances? His whole style was that way. But we know he put in long hours and worked really hard, but he didn't want to ever show it off. There were a lot of reasons for that. And partly that was his old style from his Hollywood days. Partly there was value in being underestimated, which has been talked about. Partly, I think he consciously wanted to convey to the American people that the president's got things in hand. Because I think he perceived, I don't think you ever heard him say this, maybe once or twice he hinted at this, but he perceived that it was the overwhelming burdens of office that you could see affected in the bearing of Lyndon Johnson and Jimmy Carter was actually bad for them and bad for the country. So, now I maybe overcompensated a little bit, making it look too easy, but a lot of that was art to conceal how hard he worked and so forth. He was a very disciplined guy. And your other question was, oh, relevance for today. Well, I was talking to Professor Kessler's class this afternoon. Reagan was the ultimate fusionist. That's an old term from the 60s from the National Review crowd. In other words, he represented both of the dominant wings of conservatism, sort of libertarian half and the sort of traditional, you know, Russell Kirk wing, you might say, of people who believe in order and you know, religious sources and so forth. So on the one hand, Reagan says in 1976 in an interview that I believe that libertarianism is the heart and soul of conservatism. And in the campaign in 1980, he appears before, I'm not sure it's a Southern Baptist, but one of the really large religious groups where he says, I know that you can't endorse me as a nonpartisan organization, but I want you to know that I endorse you. And he's also, remember, sincerely anti-abortion. Publishes a book about his views on abortion, a very strongly written book in 1984. So, you know, he represented in one person, you know, both strands of modern conservative thought that have a lot of dynamic tension between them and a lot of difficult to resolve contradictions. But he did it more skillfully than anybody. That's the kind of thing I think you want to imitate. I don't think, my personal opinion, I don't think there's much future on a national scale for Ron Paul. I mean, I kind of like the guy sometimes, but it's just, it's too much of one thing. There's not enough of everything else. And that's not going to work. Similarly, Mike Huckabee has the same problem on the other side of the ledger. If you could combine Ron Paul and Mike Huckabee, you'd have a tolerable imitation of Ronald Reagan. Anyway.
Thank you. Without anticipating the volume 3, I suppose, is the Age of Reagan done, or would you suggest that this what he started is still being worked out? And would he be happy with where things stand today? I guess kind of follow up on Brad's question.
Yeah, I think he probably wouldn't be. I think he'd be saying, you know, we got to go back to figuring out a way to limit government for real. It's not enough to. I mean, part of, by the way, his interest in the second term and the package of constitutional amendments, and he did say something like this a couple of times, is he understood that his successors wouldn't be even as resolved as he was about trying to hold back spending. And he turned out to be exactly right about that, right? So I think he'd be a back to basics. I don't think he'd reinvent the wheel or come up with anything dramatically new. Yeah, no, I don't have anything. They're not going to write a volume 3. I'm ending the story here. The postscript talks a bit about the Berlin Wall coming down and does talk a bit about Obama's comments that were referenced and where we are today. I'm thinking about a small book that would not be a narrative, but it would, might be called After Reagan, Where Conservatives Should Go Now. In part because I'm in a whole lot of hot water for the Washington Post article I wrote last week, Is Conservatism Brain Dead? ? The argument of the article had a lot in it. It essentially says no, but there are problems. But a lot of people didn't read past the headline. I've got a lot of nasty email. So the sequel will start, I take it all back, the conservative movement doesn't need new ideas, it needs reading glasses. That's my grump this week. Something else, one more? We exhausted everybody?
Yeah,
There's split back over there.
My question is whether or not you, excuse me, where to stand up, whether or not you address the demise of the Soviet Union in your book, and to what extent you attribute Reagan's foreign policies, and to what extent you attribute the weaknesses within the Soviet system itself.
Yeah, both. I mean, I mean, the Soviets will say that Reagan accelerated our decline by at least 5 years. And the two were the economic pressures they put on him. I made brief reference to this earlier. There really was a conscious policy. It wasn't wholly successful, but it had a lot of success of diminishing the hard currency earnings of the Soviet Union. Essentially what Reagan said is, we're going to quit subsidizing their war machine and make it costly for them, not only to keep building all these arms, but to keep supporting all the mischief around the world they were doing in Nicaragua and Afghanistan and elsewhere, raise the cost of empire. But then Gorbachev and some of the reformers around him, I say Gorbachev was a confused guy. There were a couple of guys around him, very senior to him, and they secretly really wanted to smash the place up. They realized it was completely bankrupt, and there's some interesting episodes that we may get to the bottom of someday if they ever open all their archives. But they used all kinds of provocations to fire lots of senior bureaucrats and close down whole ministries. And, but there was no sort of master plan about this. They just wanted to take a wrecking ball and stuff. But they couldn't control that, of course. Because once you really opened up, really liberalized for real, it spun out of their control. There's two episodes in particular I mentioned in the book. One is in 1987, this German teenager flies a Cessna airplane and lands it on Red Square. And Gorbachev used this to clean house in the military. And to the point where people even then said, was he secretly behind that? I mean, this is one of those, this is Glenn Beck time, right? The other one is equally interesting. When Gorbachev was out of town in early 1988, and he'd said the year before to all the sort of in the media, we don't want to censor you guys anymore. You just write what you want. And they're like, you're kidding, right? No, we don't want to, quit sending us your stuff to review. We're tired of this. You do what you want. So one of the leading literary journals published a stinging attack on Gorbachev in, I want to say February of 1988. Made big news in the Soviet Union. It's by some obscure professor who we weren't sure really existed. And Gorbachev used this as an occasion to go around the Politburo and say, who's behind this? You agree with this article? You? I mean, he was calling out everybody around the Politburo table, some of whom he still wanted to weed out. One of the first things he did when he took office was to try to cashier all the old Brezhnev cronies. You got to wonder, was he behind that article? Maybe not, but if he was, that's one of the things a guy would try to do, is really trying to, put some stick about. Who knows? It works either way. But it is a fascinating story that we still don't know the whole of. But I spent a lot more time looking into that than I thought I would, because so much has been translated. And you really do see things changing and turning. But that begins to happen early on, too. I do talk about a very important episode in 1982 is when the Israelis have a short war with Syria. And it was short because the Syrians got clobbered. I think the Syrians lost 78 airplanes and Soviet-made airplanes, right? And the Israelis lost none. Yeah. And I quote this one story of a Syrian complaining to a Russian. The Russian said, hey, we gave you our best surface-to-air missiles. And the Syrian said, yeah, but next time we'd like surface-to-plane missiles. But you see, it was then the Soviet military, and all not the KGB, the Soviet military, and one of them even admitted it to an American reporter, says, you guys have little kids playing all these video games and they're going to be on computers soon. Says, we don't have any computers in our country. And the military is telling the civilian leadership, the Americans are ahead of us now and they're going to leave us so far behind if we don't modernize our economy. And this was a problem, a huge problem for them, because fax machines are illegal, right? Copy machine, couldn't own a copy machine in the Soviet Union. Well, that's not going to work. So that part of the story plays into it too, and I try and capture a little bit of that. Because just the computing power alone becomes a huge story starting about 1980 or maybe even earlier. So anyway, well, thank you all. This was fun.